In 1643, Great Britain was tearing itself apart. The English Parliament was locked in a civil war against King Charles I, bleeding troops and resources. Parliament summoned 121 theologians to London, issuing a state-ordered mandate to draft a religious treaty that would secure military assistance. Confined to the stone walls of the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey, these men were tasked with fulfilling England's side of a hard political bargain. The Scottish Covenanters agreed to supply troops, demanding a unified state-church confession binding England, Scotland, and Ireland together. The theologians had to engineer a text specific enough to shut out Rome, yet elastic enough to bridge the ideological divides between competing national factions. If the document was too rigid, the alliance would fracture, and the king would win. The resulting Westminster Confession of Faith was shaped by the immediate necessity of political survival. The danger inside the chamber mirrored the war outside. Writing a mathematically precise theology threatened to alienate key allies. Prolocutor William Twiss championed eternal justification. Because God's decrees are absolute, he taught the elect were justified from eternity, never actually under divine wrath in history. Twiss faced a powerful moderate faction, led by the Davenant School and Scottish Commissioner Samuel Rutherford. They demanded an infralapsarian order, a step-by-step sequence of salvation where the individual is rescued in time. To prevent a mutiny, the committees deployed calculated ambiguity. They engineered phrases allowing both sides to sign the same page while applying different logical frameworks. This escape hatch in Chapter 3 stated God foreordained all the means, allowing moderates to split eternity from history. This linguistic maneuvering saved the Three-Kingdom Alliance, but marginalized the non-sequential consistency of William Twiss.
The theological casualty of this diplomacy surfaced in Chapter 11, where the Assembly codified exactly how a person stands trial before God. The text specifically rejected Twiss's eternal justification. It reads, "God did from all eternity decree to justify all the elect. Nevertheless, they are not justified until the Holy Spirit doth in due time actually apply Christ unto them." This creates the legal gap. An individual chosen in eternity and redeemed at Calvary is born into the world existing under the active condemnation of God's law, remaining a legal child of wrath. This gap remains open until a specific chronological second. The rescue only takes legal effect when the person hears a sermon and exercises conscious faith. The Assembly's political compromise birthed a structural paradox. A temporary phase emerged where a person belongs to Christ eternally, but to the devil legally. To see where this sequential logic fractures, we have to contrast it with the scriptural mechanics of monergism, articulated in Ephesians 2, where a dead soul is sovereignly made alive. The Holy Spirit breathes life into the dead soul, independent of human cooperation. Like a dead seed suddenly flooded with vitality, regeneration is an immediate, secret act of God. This brings us to biblical faith. Theology divides it into two ontological layers. The foundation is the habitus. The habitus is the implanted disposition, the new nature embedded directly by God without a single human psychological action. The second layer is the actus, the conscious cognitive act of believing. But the actus does not generate life. It is simply the active manifestation of the habitus that was already implanted. In Romans 4, Paul is careful to contrast this act of believing with a meritorious work.
Faith is positioned as the exact opposite of earning a wage. It is a confession of complete spiritual bankruptcy. True biblical belief is the reflex of a spiritual lung taking its first breath. It is the instrumental symptom of a rescue that has already occurred, not the legal prerequisite required to trigger it. When you force this objective biblical reality through the moderate faction's historical sequence, the system begins to loop back on itself. By withholding justification until the cognitive act of believing occurs, the Assembly structured salvation to wait on a human psychological action. This logic introduces a contradiction. If the Spirit has already regenerated the person with a new heart, the habitus, they are ontologically alive before they formulate a conscious thought. Keeping them legally condemned at that moment breaks the unity of God's act. This sequential demand collapses when applied to elect individuals who physically cannot hear a sermon or process a cognitive response. To escape their own logic loop, The Confession's authors built an extraordinary mode in Chapter 10. They built a wordless bypass pipe for dying infants, exempting them from the auditory mandate required for healthy adults. They were also forced to retrofit Old Testament saints into the sequence. They stretched historical reports of military judgment to act as a substitute gospel for figures like Rahab, just to trigger her conscious faith and keep the historical timeline intact. By demanding this psychological act of faith before granting legal justification, the sequential model alters the nature of belief, transforming it from a passive reception into a subtle legal condition. When you unpin faith from its monergistic root, it is forced to carry a weight it was never engineered to hold. This 17th century compromise left this structural legacy that dictates how modern traditions handle assurance. We can track the semantic drift of justification. A concrete historical verdict is gradually reduced to an unstable emotional state. As the distinction between implanted disposition and conscious act is forgotten, the gospel mutates and psychological experience becomes the ground of salvation. Assurance becomes a shifting target. Believers are trapped navigating an internal maze, constantly checking the quality of their own faith to prove they are saved. When the monergistic root is forgotten, the focus narrows to the psychological act of believing. This turns the gospel into an internal exercise of self-examination, where the primary objective is maintaining a specific emotional state. When justification exists exclusively in the experiencing of it, it rises and falls with human performance. The gospel is stripped of its objective power. To escape this collapse and recover the biblical doctrine, we have to recover the exact precision of the words we use. The different senses of faith must be fixed rigidly in place. We must differentiate the conscious act of trust from its origin, always tracing the cognitive manifestation back to the sovereign implanted disposition. This restores the unbroken architecture of true justification. Monergistic regeneration produces the conscious manifestation of belief, yielding the assurance of justification. Faith does not create your justified status. It wakes up to receive a legal reality that was already certain. Grace only takes center stage when human inability is entirely overridden by objective regeneration. This permanently secures salvation outside the reach of our own psychological performance.